I find it fascinating that Paul raises this rhetorical question immediately after setting forth his metaphor of the birth of Jacob and Esau and the preference of God for one rather than the other without a view to their works. I remember when I was a seminary student and deeply struggling over the doctrine of election, as most seminary students do. And it was just something that didn't fit with me. It didn't sit right at all to think that God dispenses his saving grace to some and not to others, and that the reason for giving some salvation and not to others doesn't rest in us, but solely in the determinate grace of God. That bothered me, because my initial response was, this just doesn't seem to be fair. And I thought, how can this be fair that God would choose to save some and not others? Now, I understood that nobody deserved salvation in the first place. And I know that if God would let the whole human race perish, he would be perfectly just so to do. And I also understood by then that the only way we could ever be saved at all was somehow by the grace of God. But I certainly didn't think it rested this heavily on the grace of God. And I thought, why would God give his grace to some people in a greater measure than he would to others? It just didn't seem fair to me. And as I struggled with it and read Edwards and the other Reformed theologians, I still wasn't convinced, and I had a little card I had on my desk in seminary, and it said this: you are required to believe and to preach what the Bible says is true, not what you would like it to say is the truth. And that put some restraints on me, because I read this passage every conceivable way, and I knew that there were people who said, well, Paul's not really talking about the election of individuals here. He's talking about the benefits of salvation that were given to the Jews rather than the Arabs, and he's talking about nations that are chosen, not individuals. That didn't persuade me for 5 minutes, because even if he were talking about nations, he illustrates it by the individuals who are at the head of that nation. So no matter how you slice it, you're still back down here wrestling with one person receiving a blessing from God and the other person not. And it's based ultimately on the good pleasure of God himself, and it still seemed not right. Now, I've written lots of books and I've taught lots of courses, and I know that when I set a thesis forth, that if I've done that often enough, you have enough practice that you can almost anticipate, or you can anticipate, not almost, but altogether anticipate the objections or the questions that people will immediately raise to a certain thesis. And at this point, at least, one of the few points I can identify with the Apostle Paul as a teacher is here, because the Apostle, when he was setting forth this doctrine, anticipated a response or a question. He no sooner spells out the sovereign grace that is given to Jacob over Esau, so he stops and says, what then is there unrighteousness in God? And one of the things that persuaded me that the Reformers had it right with respect to election was contemplating this very question. Because I thought like this, I thought, if Paul is trying to teach a semi-Pelagian or Arminian view of election, by which, in the final analysis, a person's election is based upon that person meeting some kind of condition, so that in the final analysis it's on you and what you have done, and this person hasn't done it, who would raise any objection about that's being unfair? Who would possibly raise an objection about that being involving an unrighteousness in God? That would seem manifestly fair. And I'm sure that people who teach Arminianism or semi-Pelagianism and articulate their views on this matter They have certain questions that come to them all the time that they have to answer and they have to respond to just like anybody else. But I wonder how often people protest against their teaching by saying, that's not fair. I doubt if they've ever heard that. Or wait a minute, this means that God is unrighteous. But the apostle does anticipate that response. And what is the teaching that engenders that response? It is the teaching that election is unconditional. It's when you're teaching that election rests ultimately, exclusively on the sovereign will of God and not of the performance or actions of human beings that the protest arises. And so Paul anticipates the protest. Is there unrighteousness in God? And he answers it with the most emphatic response he can muster in the language. I prefer the translation, God forbid. Then he goes on to amplify this. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So here the apostle is reminding people of what Moses had to declare centuries before, namely that it is God's divine right to execute executive clemency when and where he so desires it. He says from the beginning, I will have mercy on whom